Van Devanter is probably the most famous of the Vietnam War nurses, due in part to this, well, really because of this 1983 book and her ongoing work starting and running the Women's Project of the Vietnam Veterans of America, the VVAW. Sorry, the VVA, the Vietnam Veterans of America, yeah, which was another organization that started as a to which was outside the government to actually help veterans, because when veterans realized they weren't getting helped by the Veterans Administration, they were like, okay, we've got to do this for ourselves. And so they began to organize. And these veterans organizations are often the most important. They lead often in terms of getting medical care, in terms of getting other kinds of support in the community, and in terms of education, in terms of outreach to high schools, and explaining to young people who say they want to go into the military what that actually looks like, and so on. So these veterans administrations can be extremely important. And so she started the Women's Project because there was no, at the Vietnam Veterans Administration, pardon me, the Vietnam Veterans of America, VVA, there was no women's chapter. Basically, there was. So when she approached them, they were like, "Oh, you were in Vietnam?" And she was like, "Yeah, I was in Vietnam for a year, and I can't sleep, and my heart's pounding, and I can't breathe, and I'm having panic attacks." And or they didn't know what it was, and they were like, "Well, did you ever kill anybody?" I mean, she was like, "No, I was saving people." And they were like, "Well, weren't you trained for that? I mean, what's your problem, girl?" So took her a long time to educate the male veterans, and they were like, oh, why are you complaining? I mean, you had it good. You had three hots and a cot, as as they say, and the reality, of course, is, as you know from this book and from the little pieces I've given you of it, that the hospital itself came under fire. They had to go on operating, and they operated in some dreadful conditions, apart from operating under fire. So she says about her story, "Who would have wanted to listen? Mine were not nice, neat stories. There was love, but no cute little love stories. Heroes, but no grand, heroic war stories. Winners, but you had to look hard to tell them from the losers. On our battlefields, there were no knights in shining armor rescuing damsels in distress. The stories, even the funny ones, were all dirty. They were rotten, and they stank. The moments, good and bad, were permeated with the stench of death and napalm." This is on page 13. Now, this should sound familiar by now from somebody who has read Tim O'Brien and Michael Hare, which you have, where she's saying, don't expect your daddy's war story. This is not because your daddy would have been a World War II veteran, so don't expect their war stories. This is not that. There's a rather wonderful moment when the newly returned Van Devanter is at home with her very naive American family, and she is so, army at this point that she asks them to pass the fucking salt, and, they're like, oh my God, they're all so horrified. And this is just a sort of a slight indication of the acclimation, that is the acclimatization, to an America which in 1970 had no idea what it was like to have been in Vietnam, and didn't really want to hear another word about it, because after all, it had already caused these riots on campuses. Everybody had a position on Vietnam. It was an enormously divisive issue. If you wanted to ruin a party, all you had to say was, isn't it terrible what's happening in Vietnam? And there was going to be a fight, which might very well end up as a punch-up. So the people were sick of hearing from the veterans. They didn't want to hear about them. They were like, shut up. The World War II veterans said to the Vietnam War veterans, look, we won our war. You lost yours. Shut up about it. We don't want to hear. When we came home, we got jobs and we carried on with life. We got married. We had children. And when you came home, you started bitching and, how tough life is and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, we're not sympathetic. You think we had an easy time of it, and so on. And this is one of the differences between coming home from World War II, which was considered by the culture to be a just war, and coming home from Vietnam, which by the time, say, it was 1968 or 1969 to 70, was clearly a war that made no sense whatsoever to anybody, including the people who were running it. It was clear to the top generals like Westmoreland had pretty much gone. They were living. I was going to say they were gone bonkers, but really they were living in their own worlds of fantasy about, what where the war could go. I mean, that was ridiculous to have Westmoreland say, I need 1 million men. What a nightmare. It's like having Trump say, not 4 more years, 40 more years. It's like, oh yeah, you're like, okay, yeah, that's a little crazy. So the feeling here is that nurses in Vietnam, like thousands of other nurses before them, who worked near or in combat zones, often forward enough that they were killed by rocket or mortar fire, were never awarded medals. Well, not at the time. As later on, I think the Veterans Administration or the military began to strike medals. That is, they began to create medals that were issued to the nurses who survived. Like any other veteran, Van Deventer understands that she has to harden herself, and she's told this on page 105 by one of the doctors, who says, "You'll learn how to get tougher, or you won't survive this year." And in the short run, hardening oneself sounds like a good idea. It sounds like a survival tactic. But it can be that it's actually very, very low. It's really not a good idea, but it looks like a good idea because you think, okay, I'll just toughen up, I won't let anything get to me. The problem is that later, when the crisis is past, there can be a terrible reckoning if the individual doesn't have significant help in softening and coming to terms with the traumas that they've witnessed or survived, or both, and living in the world then becomes a world of threats, which is a permanent combat zone. And this is part of the way the brain has been altered, because the brain is plastic. At the time, it was not thought that the brain altered very much, except to sort of decline as you got older. In the 70s, neuroplasticity wasn't the term that people were using with any regularity. Now we look at neuroplasticity and say, yeah, the brain can be changed, in fact, and it isn't just a matter of the brain sort of getting more and more sophisticated, and the pathways becoming hardened by the time you're, say, 21 or 22, and then that's it. It turns out to be a lot more complex than that. So this idea that the brain could be changed again after a trauma was actually not new, but it has gained a lot more credence now.